Hello everyone and welcome to the LSE Christian Union's first ever COVID Conversations evening. My name is Paddy, I'm one of the LSE CU's co-presidents. We're really excited about these COVID Conversations evenings. I think during this global pandemic, a time of real uncertainty, more and more of us have been thinking about some big issues, thinking what's it all about. And I think these evenings are going to be really helpful in unpacking some of those questions and thinking about them together. So we're hoping to run a COVID Conversations event once every 2 weeks throughout Michaelmas term. And this evening we're really thrilled to be joined by Jeremy Moses. Jeremy is from Grace Church, which is a church in London, and tonight he's going to be unpacking the issue of finding peace in an anxious and uncertain world. If as Jeremy's talking you have any specific questions, or there's anything he says that you'd like to discuss further, please join us on a Zoom call, which will be happening directly after this event at 7:15. Jeremy will be on the Zoom call and he's more than up for taking questions from you guys, so that should be a really great time. If you'd like the link for that and you don't have access to it, please also send us a message on Instagram or Facebook. But for now I'm going to hand over to Jeremy. Thanks very much.
Hi there, my name's Jeremy. I'm from a church called Grace London, based in the centre of the city in Waterloo. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today, but I'm delighted to be speaking to you, and we'll have a chance to have some discussion and kind of back and forth over Q&A after you've had a chance to discuss and chew over some of the things I'm going to share with you this evening. So this evening I want to talk to you on the question of finding peace in an anxious and uncertain age. First of all, let's diagnose the problem. What do we mean by this? Well, most number of social scientists have identified that we're experiencing something of a kind of explosion in anxiety, perhaps might be described as an anxiety epidemic, and the statistics on this are really significant. In the US, it said that in 1980, about 4% of Americans had experienced a kind of medical anxiety disorder in some way. And it's now estimated that even half the population in the US has suffered in this way. In the UK, it's suggested that 1/3 of Britons will at some point in their life experience a medically recognised anxiety disorder of some kind. And of course, that doesn't account for the fact that many others might just experience a kind of low level of anxiety that doesn't reach the threshold to be medically recognised, but they experience the anxiety. And actually this has experienced something of an explosion, particularly in the last decade, and Gen Z, which I guess you're all part of, are kind of at the eye of the storm in this. And of course this predates COVID. In fact, some of it can be traced back to 2012. A couple of social scientists, one called Jean Twenge, who's a sociologist, another called Cal Newport, have both identified this trend. Cal Newport, who's a computer scientist, wrote a book called Digital Minimalism. It's a really good book. Describes having an interview with a head of mental health services in a US university. And they said before 2012 they experienced the kind of standard mental health experiences for young people, homesickness, OCD, eating disorders, kind of typical teenage issues. But then almost overnight they describe a real change. This is what they said. Then everything changed seemingly overnight. The number of students seeking mental health counselling massively expanded, and the standard mix of teenage issues was dominated by something that used to be relatively rare: anxiety. So what's driving this explosion? Well, Jean Twenge, the sociologist I mentioned, wrote an article provocatively titled, you can find it, it's written in The Atlantic, called "Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation?" And the first thing she's getting at is really our digital technology usage is partly responsible for the rise in anxiety. And she describes how in 2012, which she's a researcher and kind of looked at all different stats, and how the stats really significantly changed around anxiety. And what was significant about 2012 was that smartphones passed 50% penetration. So over half the people in the US had smartphones at that point. And she describes iGen, which again you would be part of, those who were born between 1995 and 2012. And this generation, your generation, has never experienced a time in their life where the internet didn't exist, and smartphones are basically ubiquitous in their kind of conscious memory. And she describes that this generation are on the brink of the worst mental health crisis in decades. And one of the big factors she's driving at here is the explosion in both smartphone usage and social media. It describes how higher screen time is associated with higher incidence of depression in teenagers, and of course all the kind of flaws of social media, the way that they can make you sad about your when you compare the lives that you witness of those on screen with your own experience, the fact that they give the kind of illusion of social relationships, but actually they don't give you a real tangible experience of embodied relationships, something that many of us can feel frustrated with right now for obvious reasons, and actually even how higher social media usage can lead to you feeling more lonely. And so actually, that's why many of us, myself included, really want to think carefully about how we use social media. I certainly don't have social media except WhatsApp on my phone, and trying to really minimise the amount of time I use my smartphone because I'm aware that it can lead to anxiety. So that's the first reason that we've identified. Second reason is because many in our generation, this is a little bit more long term, have kind of detached ourselves from community. Individualism is the mantra that dominates our culture, that kind of language of you do you and you pursue your dreams. And as a result, millennials, and I'm assuming this is true for Gen Z as well, are less likely to join clubs, to see friends, much more likely to live according to a kind of individual narrative of pursuing their own dreams, of making their own choices. And that language sounds intuitively compelling, but in doing so, it means that it takes us away from our existing social networks, from our friends and our families. And that's why many people, whether students and young professionals, find themselves alone in the big city pursuing their dreams, and they kind of feel like that's the fulfillment they were looking for, but actually it's a much more lonely and less fulfilling existence they were expecting. The other problem with individualism is it kind of leads us to puts a lot of pressure on ourselves to figure out the meaning and purpose of our own lives on our own. It used to be the case that you kind of learnt your meaning and purpose from your community and from the relationships you were in. But now there's a lot of pressure on young people to say, well, you have to find what really matters to you. And actually, rather than being liberating, that's a kind of crushing weight. The writer Will Hutton said this: everyone is expected to find their personal route to happiness at the same time as the bonds of society, faith and community, tried and tested mechanisms to support well-being, are fraying. So you have to find your own personal route to happiness without looking to society and religion and relationships. And actually that's quite an intimidating prospect, particularly at a young age. So you can see detachment from community, the language of individualism, the explosion in digital technology, all as factors behind a kind of growth in anxiety. We have to. You may want to pick up on some of that in the Q&A, and you're very welcome to. But also there's the reality of uncertainty. And obviously we all know that kind of right now, because COVID is a kind of very present reality for us, that uncertainty is something we all feel. We're confronted by the reality that we can't control the future. It's not that we don't know what's coming up, it's that we probably know that there's going to be some kind of suffering involved. And for that reason, we kind of don't really like knowing the future's coming, so to speak, because we expect there might be more suffering. And I think we can see this kind of fear of the future in many of our anxieties, many of our many of the things that make us stressed, whether it be the micro uncertainty of how am I going to do on my course? Am I going to do well? Am I going to succeed? Am I going to meet my parents or my own expectations? Maybe the fear of missing out on a normal university experience. Maybe the fear of being lonely, of not making friends and being in deep relationships with others. So there's kind of micro fears of our own lives, but then there's also macro fears that we're assaulted with in the news all the time, whether it be the fear around COVID and what's that going to do to our nation or nations around the world. Brexit, we used to talk about that a lot, now probably less so because of COVID, but there was a time when that fear really gripped the nation. Climate change, something that we're all very aware of, and the fear of that kind of dominates much discussion on campus, I'm sure, and also fear around the economy and jobs and what the state of the nation will be when you graduate. So there's all sorts of fears, both about our own individual lives and also kind of around the nation circulating. And what I suggest to you is that I think the secular culture we're in doesn't give us the resources to adequately deal with the problem of fear, with the reality of anxiety, and really because it can't deal with the reality of suffering. Think about all those things, those fears are really fears about suffering in the future, either about yourself or about loved ones or about the society, in some way experiencing deprivation or suffering or living a life less than what you wanted it to be. And actually what's remarkable is many sociologists would suggest that our society is comparatively ill-equipped to deal with the problem of suffering. Paul Brand, who was a prominent pioneering orthopedic surgeon who operated in both India and the US, suggested that actually from working in the US he saw a very different, very weak capacity to deal with the problem of suffering, much more weaker in the kind of developed West than other nations. He says, in the US, and I think we can assume the UK, I encountered a society that seeks to avoid pain at all costs. Patients lived at a greater comfort level than I had previously treated, but they seemed far less equipped to handle suffering and far more traumatized by it. And as I say, sociologists often look at Western culture and say it's profoundly ill-equipped to deal with the problem of suffering. And I think it's partly because of the prevailing worldview. We believe in a material world, that's all there is. There's no overarching purpose to life, no creator, and that your life is fundamentally, really, in simple terms, an accident. And in that case, it means that basically all suffering is senseless. There's no meaning or purpose to suffering because there's no meaning and purpose to life. Actually, if you look at this is very different to almost all cultures historically. Almost all cultures would seek to find a purpose to suffering. They might say, well, no, suffering is good because it helps you to become a better person. Or maybe suffering is, in the East, you might say it's kind of suffering as a way to the path to enlightenment. But a secular person can't do that because they have no bigger vision of their life than really just pursuing or maximizing their own happiness. And when you think, if life is exclusively about your own happiness, if there's no higher meaning or purpose to life, then when you experience suffering, which we inevitably all will, I think it will crush you because you say, well, there's no purpose to life then because I'm not happy. And so you have no sense of higher purpose to sustain you through that suffering. And so I think as a result, our culture really has two responses to the problem of suffering, but neither are particularly able to deal with this problem. One is a kind of distraction, a detachment. That's why many of us, the first thing when we're feeling anxious, you might start scrolling your phone and looking at Facebook, Instagram, and you're trying to just kind of distract yourself from the reality of feeling anxious. Or maybe you might switch on a box set on Netflix and just kind of try and pretend your problems away, try and deny them. But of course, the real problem why this doesn't work is because the minute you stop scrolling, the minute you turn off Netflix, your problems are still there. Distraction is at best a temporary salve to the problem, that's the things that are causing you anxiety or uncertainty. And the second one is a kind of more opaque thing, but it's a sense of progress. Many of us grew up with it in an era of believing that the world was going to get better and we were going to find technology to solve our problems. And I'm sure that's true, that technology has many, many blessings. But I think we're seeing now, even as the world develops, there are new problems, new challenges that humanity faces, like climate change or COVID. And so really this kind of myth that things were just going to get better and one day we're going to eliminate suffering, I think most of us would recognise that's a kind of false hope now. And so I don't think the secular culture really has the resources to equip us to deal with the problem of suffering. So how will we deal with anxiety and uncertainty? And I want to give you the Christian response. First of all, if you're not a Christian, I think I want to show you this is the most compelling response to the problem of suffering, not just because I believe it to be true, but because I think it makes sense of our deepest longings, of things that we know to be intuitively true from our own desires. But also I want to speak to you if you're a Christian and say, actually, to grasp this response, this hope, so to speak, and to take it into inner consciousness. Just because you're a Christian doesn't mean that this Christian hope is helping you or enabling you to walk through suffering or anxiety or uncertainty. So what's the Christian response? Well, I would say the essence of the Christian response is that you have a treasure that cannot be plundered. At the core of the Christian faith is a conviction that you are loved by your Father in heaven, and that can't be taken away from you, whatever suffering that you go through, if you believe in Christ. In Hebrews 10, the writer of the book of Hebrews, it's a letter in the New Testament, it's writing to a small community of Christians, and they would have experienced much persecution, much suffering. Remember, the early Christians were an illegal cult in the Roman Empire, so they were seen as a cult. They were not culturally dominant at all. In fact, they were being killed for their faith. So they were experiencing a great deal of suffering and persecution, and this writer, in this just brief quote that I'm going to give you, gives the key to how they're able to experience and walk through that suffering. He says, "You suffered along with those who were thrown into jail, and when all you owned was taken away from you, you accepted it with joy." Saying a very countercultural response to suffering. Why? you knew there were better things waiting for you that will last forever. He's saying you had something else that was more precious to you, even than the things that were taken away from you. He's describing how they've had their own possessions taken away from them, and which was ultimately the grounds for their satisfaction, such that they could actually allow a kind of loss. They could experience a great loss of their possessions, perhaps their reputations, to be scorned at by others, because they had something far greater. They're willing to experience great suffering because they had something that couldn't be taken away from them. And really the essence of the Christian faith, what we call the gospel, the good news, is that God loved you so much that he was willing to send his son, Jesus Christ, to die for you on the cross so that you might be reconciled to God. And a Christian is simply someone who's responded to God's invitation through Christ to be in relationship with him, to experience his love for eternity. And so the Christian has assurance, really, that they are in that relationship with Christ, come what may. That whatever suffering they go through, whatever they do, because it's grounded on Christ's faithfulness and what Christ did for them on the cross, it means that they have a love, they received a love into their lives, and they continue to be sustained by that love in a way that means that kind of love is fundamentally secure. It means they might lose their job, they might drop out of your course, but the thing that's most precious to you, that is the love of God that they've encountered, the relationship to them which is most important, cannot be taken away from you. It means you have a freedom. It means actually you might not have the perfect university experience, but you have Christ. You have the love of your Father in heaven, which can't be taken away from you. It means that suffering will feel hard, but not impossible. It won't break you, it won't crush you, because the greatest source of joy and comfort in your life cannot be taken away from you. This is why another letter in the New Testament from Paul in the book of Romans says, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword?" Of course, he's describing a whole bunch of real threats to Christians in that time. Many of them might experience famine. They were living on the kind of life on the edge, so to speak, or they might, as I said, experience persecution. They're real things they might face. He says, no, in all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. He's saying none of these things, none of the suffering of life can separate you from the source of love, the love of God, which is greater comfort and greater source of joy than anything else. Well, this speaks to the fact that as a human being, you were fundamentally made to be in a relationship with God. It means that it should be no surprise to us that many of us intuitively believe that love and probably human relationships, most people assume, are the kind of thing that will make them happiest in life. Scientists can already tell you that love, the experience of love as a child and as a baby, is essential to human physical and emotional development. And really, I think that points to the fact that actually, that the very centre of every human being is that we were made for a relationship with the God who loves us. That you were designed to be in relationship with him. And actually to live life without relationship with him is to almost set yourself up for failure, to experience life which is not truly satisfying. Because it's only when you encounter this unconditional love in Christ that you'll be truly satisfied. Because it says every human relationship is in some sense fundamentally insecure. I mean, even I'm married, I've got 2 kids, but it's very possible that one of us will let each other down on a regular basis, and we won't love the other like we need to be or like we want to be loved. Actually, it's saying there's only one love that is fundamentally secure and unchanging, and that's the love of Christ, a love that kind of never runs dry. And so the Christian has great comfort in suffering, because they say, God is with me. It says they have a God who enters into our suffering. The story of the Christian faith is that Christ, the divine Son of God, loved us so much he was willing to come down, inhabit human flesh, walk through a life including much suffering, and then ultimately to suffer death on the cross, a humiliating and cruel death. And so we have a God who knows what it's like to suffer, who has entered into our suffering. And so as we walk through suffering, we can be assured that Christ understands us. He sympathises with the pain and suffering that we experience. Now, I'm not saying that suffering need be absolutely part of your life and be part of the kind of part of your mantra. But what I'm saying is, if suffering happens in your life, you know that God is with you and you know that his love is secure. And that means actually you can live with a kind of conscious reality of uncertainty. You don't know what's around the corner. You can't control the future, but actually that's okay because you have a God who loves you, who is sovereign, and who will walk through that suffering with you. There's one other point which I want to make before I finish, which is that Christ gives you a hope that suffering will one day come to an end. In a sense, it's an end to uncertainty, because it actually says, no, it's certain that one day suffering will be finished. I think really what this speaks to is the fact that behind all our fears and anxieties is the problem of death. We're conscious of our own mortality, even not necessarily saying we're actually all the time thinking that we're going to die, but just that the reality of death does shape how we feel. I think it's the reality of death that makes us anxious about our performance. That means that we must be as successful as possible. Many of us feel that, and you're at a very good university, so I'm sure many people around you feel that. Sometimes it's because we feel, I have one life to live. I have to kind of make a stance and to be remembered, almost a kind of longing to almost be immortal. That desire for success comes from the fact that we're conscious that we have a limited number of years on this earth, that we're conscious of our mortality, so it drives us to success. Sometimes I think our mortality can be the reason why some of us experience health anxiety. Really, we're not worried about health. What we're worried about is the reality that all of us are getting older, that we're experiencing decay. Even you as a 20-year-old or 19-year-old are experiencing some kind of human frailty, and as a guy in his early 30s, I also can relate to that already. That we know that our bodies are not perfect, and that we're part of a fallen world where we're decaying in some way. And one day we will die. And also, even this mortality, I think, speaks to a fear of loneliness. We don't want to be separated from others, which is ultimately the great fear of death, that we'll be separated from the love that sustains us and we're in our lives. But the Christian faith has the answer to the problem of death, and that is that Christ has conquered death. The Christian story is that Christ died on the cross and then 3 days later was resurrected. It's promised that all who believe in him will be resurrected with him and spend eternity with him. What this means is that there's no longer the fear of death for those who follow Christ, that they have the confidence that they will experience eternal life with him. Now, the problem is when I speak about this, you kind of picture angels and harps and clouds, but it's actually speaking of a restoration of this world, a world where there's no more suffering or pain, that Christ will come back to establish his rule on this earth and bring an end back to all the evil that we see in the world, all the suffering that we see, and actually one of the great language lines that's in the Bible that talks about wiping away every tear, that there'll be no more suffering or pain when Christ returns to this earth. And so what this says is you will experience suffering in this life, that you're right in one sense to say life is uncertain. In one sense, when someone experiences anxiety about something that might happen, it is true, it may happen, but one day Christ is coming back to bring an end to death and an end to all suffering, which is the cause of angst in our culture. Last thing I want to say is that actually the Christian faith is grounded in reality. It's not some spurious myth. It's based on historical events about the life and ministry and ultimately the death and resurrection of the person of Christ who lived 2,000 years ago. A couple of years ago I was in Jerusalem and I was on Herod's tower that was built by the ruler Herod, who was the king when Christ was born. You could stand on the tower and you could look at the Mount of Olives where Jesus prayed the night before he was crucified. I looked to the left, I could see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which marks where Christ was crucified. And what this speaks of is the fact that the events of the Bible are not some kind of myth written about a land far away. They're historical claims written about a real person who really lived in a real place. And just like you might be in a court of law and you have to weigh up the claims that witnesses make, so when you look at the Christian faith, you have to weigh up the claims that the gospel writers, the Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, the four accounts of Jesus' life, and say, are these reliable? And I'm convinced there's really good, credible evidence to believe that Christ was who he said he was, that he really was crucified, and against all the odds, he really was resurrected, proving that he was God. And why I say all of this, and I'm happy to pick up on that in the Q&A, is that it's not a kind of vain myth that I'm putting my faith in that gives me hope in the face of suffering. It's actual reality that is grounded in reality that gives me real, tangible assurance of Christ's love and the knowledge that he will bring an end to suffering. And so what I want to provoke you then is say, if you're a Christian, actually, that you can be fearless. They say that you will suffer, but actually Christ is your greatest treasure, that nothing can separate you from him, that you've received his love and that you might be sustained by his love each day, that you have something far greater than anything else that you might lose, that Christ is with you in your suffering, and that one day Christ will bring an end to suffering. That's the truth for a Christian. I think when I say if you're not a Christian, then really that I want you to see that the Christian faith is built on a tangible historical events, and it's much more real and lasting than you realise, and actually it speaks to your deepest longings. Now, I know I've only just touched the surface on this. As I said, I hope you guys have a nice discussion. There'll be some questions coming out, and then love to come and take your Q&A and discuss this with you. So thank you very much, and see you soon.
Thank you so much for that, Jeremy. That was really awesome, brought up a lot of big questions. If you'd like to discuss this further with us, we're going to be having a Zoom call in just a couple of minutes. That's going to be starting at 7:15. So as I said at the start, if you want the details for that, please send us a message on Instagram or Facebook and we'll be happy to send you the link. Jeremy's going to be on the call, so he'll be happy to take some questions about any of the things that he said this evening. The only other thing to say is we're hoping to run these COVID Conversations evenings once every 2 weeks throughout the term. So the next one will be on October the 22nd, and we really hope to see you there as well. Thank you very much.